Look back at our definition of rights. Something you deserve simply because you exist, regardless of whether they can be taken away or not. Again, this is something that's really hard for human beings to agree on. But when we look at John Locke's three fundamental rights, life, liberty, and property, those generally, I think if you eliminate property, and even if you eliminate the American version, the pursuit of happiness, life and liberty seem to be rights that all human beings can agree on. But there are certain countries in the world that you could go to and you should say, hey, I have a right to liberty. And they'll say, no, you don't. And they'll lock you up in prison because you talked back to the state. Clearly, we cannot agree on rights. So we can't look immediately to John Locke for all of the answers. But that doesn't mean that rights don't exist. John Locke is not the only person who talks to us about rights. So today we're going to look at a couple of additional theories of rights that are even more secular than John Locke, and this will be the last of our look at secular ethics before we move on to our next topic in morality. So today we're going to focus on the theories of rights. The first person we're going to take a look at is a philosopher by the name of Tom Regan. So we look at John Locke, and he is so influential to American ethics and our understanding of rights. But despite all of that, a lot of modern ethicists, and I think this is a bit ridiculous, but for the sake of treating things fairly, most modern ethicists don't accept John Locke's theory of rights because it implies that it comes from a higher power. So it's naturally theological. If you're an ethicist who doesn't believe in God or doesn't want to assume in the existence of God, that's not going to work out for you. I think that's a reach, but for the sake of fairness, we'll take a look at Tom Regan. And Tom Regan is just one of these. There are many. But these theorists claim that human beings, and to some extent some animals, have rights because of some distinctive ability or capacity they possess, and not because God has bestowed these rights on us. Question is, though, what is that? There's a reason why I include animals in the conversation, because Tom Regan is not just an ethicist, he's also an animal rights activist, which is if you do a deep dive into ethics as a school of philosophy, you're going to notice that a lot of modern ethicists are animal rights activists as well. So Tom Regan, as an animal rights activist, claims that humans and animals have rights, and this is important, because they are experiencing subjects of life. That's a quote from him. Experiencing. Now, what does that mean? When you look at your pet, if it's a dog or a cat, if it's a goldfish, probably not a goldfish, but at least your dogs and your cats, especially your dogs, maybe your cats. If I asked you, do they have a conscience? You'd probably say yes. I remember I grew up with a dog, and I remember when my dog did something wrong, and we caught her doing something wrong, or if she was acting weird, then we would know that something was wrong. She would be very guilty. She would portray herself very guiltily, if that's a word. My mom was always strict. She was the strict one. She was the disciplinarian. I was kind of lenient with my dog. If she wanted to come love up on me, I would always let her. So when she did something wrong, let's say she got into the trash, and my mom would be really mad at her, and she would say, don't give her any attention. She's done something wrong. She'd avoid my mom and she'd hunker down, but she'd always try to come seek me out because she knew that I couldn't stay mad at her, and she would she would hang out with me until my mom would get over whatever she did. That seems to be a very human characteristic or a very human trait. There's a biological explanation for that behavior, probably in humans as well, but boy, that really does seem, it seems as if that's a sign of consciousness, at least for a lot of people. And so they elevate, at least dogs, and maybe cats to a certain extent, they elevate dogs to this level that's almost or directly on par with human beings. And they treat dogs as equals in, if you remember, ontology. Ontology is the state of being. Humans are generally declared to be higher up, but people really like dogs, and so now, more than ever, we're thinking that dogs are just as valuable as humans, which Tom Regan does, but he has a reason why. There's a rational explanation for this from Tom Regan. He says a conscious creature. This is an experiencing subject of life. This is what it means to be an experiencing subject of life. A conscious creature, so maybe that feeling of guilt that dogs have is one sign that points to the idea that they have a conscience. A conscious creature having an individual welfare, they care about themselves as individuals, that has importance to us regardless of its usefulness to others. That definition fits perfectly with a pet dog, especially a little puppy. It's useless, but we love it anyway, and we treat it as if it's a member of our family. Some may say we don't treat it like a member of our family. It is a member of our family. That would make your dog an experiencing subject of life. It's a subject that experiences life. So, in a similar way to Immanuel Kant, Regan believes, this is a rarity among modern philosophers, I think, Regan believes that humans have inherent value. But there's a difference between him and Kant. Unlike Kant, he doesn't limit that to just humanity. He doesn't limit that to just humans. It's not just humans that have value. All living beings have value. And because they all have values, they all have rights. And why do they have rights? Because they can experience life. See, for Regan, it all comes down to experience. All people have the same value that they're born with, and the same rights that they're born with, those things that you deserve simply because you exist. Why do you deserve those things? Because you experience life. It is possible for you to experience life. If this is true, then what quality do all human beings have in common that make them inherently valuable and the natural recipient of certain rights? What is it about us that gives us our rights? Is it just experience? Well, according to Regan, it is. It's just that. I was watching a pretty crazy video this morning of a man who he was a wildlife photographer, and he's in the middle of the Arctic, trying to get a shot of polar bears, and he has set up this glass enclosure that will protect him in case a polar bear comes up, because polar bears are hyper carnivorous. Anything with meat is prey to them, so they will hunt humans, which is unique in the animal kingdom. And lo and behold, there's a polar bear in the distance. So he gets into his glass enclosure, he closes it off, and he's ready to shoot video of this polar bear. This polar bear comes, sniffs around, investigates, and immediately it starts trying to get into the glass enclosure, because there are gaps, and polar bears have an incredible sense of smell, so they know that there's meat in this enclosure. And eventually the polar bear is trying its hardest to get into this glass enclosure. This guy is filming the entire thing. And the glass enclosure is really small. It's not big enough to fit two people, only one person. And he's in it, and the polar bear is trying to destroy it to get to him. I look at that, and my immediate reaction to this video is, boy, that is such a violent existence to be a polar bear. One, it's a difficult existence. You're in the middle of, the Arctic. You live on ice. Meat's not easy to come by, and polar bears are thousands of pounds. They need a lot of calories to survive, and so they just seem like these violent animals that only exist to hunt. And hunting, my natural instinct to that is to say, that's bad, that's violent, I don't like it, and I wish it didn't have to exist. But even Tom Regan would look at that polar bear and say, no, that polar bear also has rights. Why? Because it is a conscious creature. It can think. I mean, there's a video of it investigating this situation that has an individual welfare. It's trying to survive. It's not trying to hurt the human. It just needs food. It needs calories. And it has importance to us regardless of its usefulness to others. There are massive, just huge organizations that are devoted to polar bear, what's the word? I'm thinking the word welfare, but that's not the word. Conservation, I guess, to polar bear conservation, because we don't know how climate change is affecting polar bear populations. They're really hard to keep track of. So we're making sure we see value in polar bears because we have conservation efforts for them. But they're not necessarily useful to us, at least immediately. I can't think of any use that a polar bear can have to me. But all of those details about it makes it a subject that experiences life, and therefore even the polar bear, this violent animal that seems to only exist to hunt other animals, would also have rights, according to Tom Regan. Something else that Tom Regan says, and this is a direct response to pretty much everything we've been learning in ethics so far. If we claim that we have rights that come from our ability to reason or our decision making, then certain groups of human beings would inevitably be left out because they have disabilities. Think of newborns, useless. The mentally ill, they can't think properly. The handicapped, they either mentally handicapped or physically handicapped, there is a barrier that they have that prevents them from experiencing life through rationality and decision making. So if we're going to say that our rights come from this unique human ability to reason, well, there's a lot of humans who don't have that ability. So Tom Regan says we can't look at that and claim that rights come from those things. So because of this line of reasoning, rights should also be found in animals, according to Regan. That's pretty rational, and I'm going to leave it at that. I hope I can return to it and respond to it, because I think there's a lot that's worth responding to. But just to touch on secular ethics, let's show Tom Regan's theory of rights, and let's leave it there. The other secular theory for the existence of rights comes from a more popular or more famous philosopher, a guy by the name of John Rawls. And when we think of rights in the modern sense, our understanding of rights globally, I think still in America, we look at John Locke, but globally, our theory of rights comes from John Rawls. And this is probably something that, this is an opinion or a belief that you probably hold for yourself. John Rawls claims that basic rights, the rights that we have, they only come from, and they're only defined by social contracts. They're not necessarily something that exists. It's just something that we've agreed upon, and we're living that out. So Rawls wants to answer the question, what rights and duties should people have, and how should power, authority, opportunities, and other social goods be distributed? Now, there's a lot of details in that question, and it's a question worth answering. But this can all be consolidated. It can be narrowed down into one very simple question, and this is one of the most important questions for the entire history of humanity. What is justice? I implore you, I would love to address this in a more... if I was teaching an ethics class, I would certainly use this text, but this isn't necessarily an ethics class, and if it is, it's a very simple ethics class. You guys are not learning very complicated things. But if I was teaching a proper ethics class, I would certainly 100% use the book or the text, The Republic by Plato. I've mentioned it a lot. It's one of the most important texts for Western civilization. When I took my philosophy and the ethical life class in college, it was the main text that we used. And it's the entire text, the entire story of Plato's Republic is a group of philosophers, a group of Greek philosophers, just sitting down and talking to each other and trying to answer the question, what is justice? Now, if one of the foundational works of Western civilization and philosophy in general only deals with that one simple question, you know that this question is one of the most important questions that we need to try to find an answer to. John Rawls wants to do that. And so he claims that in order to... he takes a political approach, very similar to what Plato did, but Rawls claims that in order to form a government from the ground up, so let's say you get to build a country, and you get to define the laws, you get to define the political system that country is going to use. If you're building it from the ground up, you're going to have to take into account that certain laws must be made with, John Rawls calls it a veil of ignorance. So what does that mean? It means that any laws that you set up for your country, they have to be, there cannot be any exceptions. Any law that you uphold has to apply to every single citizen. You have to be behind this veil of ignorance. You must be blind to your race, your sex, your class, your religion, whatever. That sounds a lot like Kant, and that sounds a lot like what the founding fathers of the United States wanted or aspired to. I don't think that they did a perfect job of it. But all of those things cannot be accounted for when you're making up laws. So, what principles should be adopted to make the decisions that define these laws? John Rawls says that there are two principles that we have to look at. The first principle, each person living in your country that you made up should have an equal right to this free system of liberty for all. Again, sounds very similar to America. Each person should have an equal right to this free system of liberty for all. Now, it does sound like something American. It does sound like something that may be in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence or the Articles of Confederation. Hasn't been carried out very well in the history of our country, but John Rawls says that every person needs that equal right, that equal accessibility. But more on that in a second. But first, I want to explain what the second principle is. Social and economic inequalities should be arranged so that they are the greatest benefit of the least advantaged, and offering offices that are open to everyone under fair, equal opportunity. So, this does sound like the American dream. This sounds like what America aspires to. Social and economic inequality should be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. This does sound a little bit like a welfare system or something along those lines, but it's elevating those who, for any other reason, would not have the ability to access those equal rights that are mentioned in the first principle. But on top of that, offering offices that are open to everyone under fair equality of opportunity, well, again, this is a pillar of American democracy or of American idealism. Again, I'm going to make the caveat, it's not carried out perfectly by America, but that's still something that we talk about all the time as to what Americans want or what Americans stand for. So let's go back to that first principle. What is that first principle saying? People should be able to do whatever they choose, as long as it doesn't interfere with other people's ability to do whatever they choose. This is kind of the quintessential argument for rights, and this is something that libertarians stand by very strongly. If you want to do something, go ahead and do it. Just make sure that it's not hurting anybody else. If it hurts you, by all means, feel free. But as long as you're not hurting anybody else, I'm fine with it. This is a more modern understanding of rights, but it's one that's sort of become the norm in American ethics and American philosophy. So that's the first principle. And the second principle is saying that Rawls is going against the typical understanding, the way that we understand it, the typical understanding of socialism. Now, if you're living in a perfectly socialist system, what would be happening is that you are given a position, or maybe you work at a position that fits you best. Now, some people are really, really qualified and very talented, and they may have very good jobs, but a lot of that talent and a lot of those qualifications may come from their ability to, or from their background or their privilege. You know, it's very rare for somebody from, south side of Chicago or the inner city to rise up the ranks, go to an Ivy League school, and become a famous doctor. It's very rare for that to happen, and it's a lot of it can be attributed not to their abilities as a natural human being, but because of the environment that they were growing up in. And so a socialist would say, well, that's clearly not fair, and it isn't fair. So that person who may grow up in the inner city, they're clearly not suited to be doctors. So they should not be doctors. We shouldn't force them to be doctors. But that doesn't mean that so maybe their talents lie elsewhere. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have the same opportunities, or maybe the same or maybe a lesser existence than those who become doctors simply because of their privilege. So a socialist will sort of want to level out or even out the playing field. It's great in theory, but it's really hard to attain in practice. I'm not going to say it's immoral in practice, even though I do think it is. It's just very difficult for that to happen. Doctors deserve to be paid more than fast food workers, right? But those who tend to become doctors, they tend to come from privileged backgrounds, and those who are fast food workers tend to come from underprivileged backgrounds, and it's not fair. So Rawls is actually going against that typical understanding that, the playing field has to be evened out 100%. He takes a very a very rational approach. It is still a socialist approach, but it's a much more fair approach. If everyone could eventually become doctors, then it is still okay for doctors to receive more than fast food workers. Doctors also benefit everyone. Fast food workers benefit some. So it's best to have those positions where everybody is benefiting from. It's best to have those positions elevated and worth more than, some musician who, it's great to have them, but they're not entirely necessary, or at least the vast majority of them are unnecessary. So it's okay to have those positions that are elevated. So John Rawls, his theory of rights, it takes into account things that are crafted by humans, not necessarily things that are naturally innate within us. And so as Americans, or as people who live in a Western society, we have constructed all of these social contracts that we live under, and as a result, that has given us rights. And it just so happens that there are some countries in the world who didn't create those social contracts, and as a result, they don't have rights. It's not a nature thing. It's just something that humans do that are unique to humans. Now, we touched on this a little bit in our discussion on rights, and it's the biggest issue, I think, in politics today. What happens when rights are in conflict with one another? What if I have a right to this and it conflicts with your right to that? So when two opposite claims of rights oppose each other, and that leads to conflict, what do we do in that situation? How do we know which side is right, which side is wrong, or if both sides are right, which right trumps another person's right? Are rights even, hierarchical, or are all rights worth the same value? Well, you could argue that some rights trump other rights. So, for example, your right to life trumps somebody else's right to free speech. I find it hard to think of an example where free speech threatens your life, unless it's an immediate threat, and then it's no longer defined free speech by at least United States standards. But let's say maybe I do have a right to just generally, not specifically, generally say, hey, I'm going to kill you right now. I just said it right now, and no policemen are knocking down on my door trying to arrest me for saying that. Now, if I directed that towards somebody in the heat of the moment when I'm very angry at them, that does come across as a direct threat to their right to life. And so the ground is there for the claim that my quote-unquote right to free speech is threatening their right to life, and therefore their right to life trumps my right to free speech. So we could make that argument that certain rights trump other rights. Another argument, or another way that we can address rights being in conflict with one another, is that what appears to be a conflict of rights, two people saying your right to this is preventing my right to that. When we think of these conflict of rights, sometimes it's not actually a conflict of rights at all. So the rights to free speech, for example, it's more than just saying whatever you want. There's a reason why it is the First Amendment. If it doesn't make logical sense, at least to me, why we would include this right of saying whatever you want off the top of your head without threat of repercussions. But it does make sense to me that very often what you say affects how people portray you. And so if you were to go to China and you were to stand in the middle of a public square and say, I think that the Chinese government is committing atrocities against individual liberties and freedoms, you're not going to be standing in that center for very long, because there is no free speech. Now, in the United States, the reason why we have the right to free speech is to stand up against authority that is beating down on other rights. So in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, when the civil rights movement was in full swing, Martin Luther King Jr. utilized his right to free speech to protest against the freedom and the liberty that was being encroached upon by the American government of its citizens, specifically black citizens. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. had the right to free speech. He could have gone out before his "I Had a Dream" speech on the Washington Mall. He could have gone to that podium, got up to the microphone, and just said whatever he wanted to. And he would have the right to do that because there's the right to free speech. But he used his right to free speech to challenge the government, to challenge authority when there was something clearly wrong going on. See, our right to free speech exists in the United States to make sure that our other rights are being protected. So in reality, when we're looking at a conflict of rights, very often it's just a misunderstanding of the situation. We have to establish rules, though, so that can be properly understood. And people categorically misunderstand most of the rights that are given to us in our amendments. I think the right to free speech is completely misunderstood. The freedom of religion is completely misunderstood. The Second Amendment with guns, completely misunderstood. It's not that there's a conflict and we're disagreeing. It's simply a fact that all of those rights that we have are just misunderstandings. So we have to be clear in our approach, which is why we have the court systems, which is why the Supreme Court is usually dealing with constitutional law. This is why we have those things, so that any of those misunderstandings can be flushed away. Do the courts get it right all the time? No. Would it be convenient for us to have access to the founding fathers and what their original intentions were? Yes, but that's just not possible. So we have to be able to hash these things out so that we have a clear understanding and a mutual understanding of what our rights actually are and what they actually mean. So here's the big question. Do rights actually exist? Based on the three theories that we looked over, we looked at John Locke, we looked at Tom Regan, we looked at John Rawls. They're all telling us different things. John Locke says yes, because they come from God. Tom Regan says yes, and all other living things do because life is given rights. John Rawls says no, they're just simply things that we constructed socially. They're social contracts. So we're being told all of these different things. Regardless of whether rights actually exist or not, it's really important that we use the language of rights. And remember that phrase, language of rights, because we're going to see it again. When I talk about the language of rights, here's what I mean. I say it is my right to do this, or when I say it is my right to do this, I am saying that this thing that I want to do is really important. It's something that's incredibly significant, not only to me, but I think it should be incredibly significant to you as well. So using that language and saying that we have all these rights, it allows us to frame how we treat those who may not be able to stand up for themselves. Now, a lot of us are stronger than others, whether that be physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And so if we're stronger or if we're more skilled in those things, we are required to stand up for those who are weaker in those things. And this is where rights are so important. They allow us to frame how to treat those who are marginalized. But this is a double-edged sword, Because as good as using the language of rights is to treat those who may not be able to stand up for themselves, it also tends to blind us to our moral obligations. And you see this a lot in America. We're throwing around the word right quite a lot, and we're sort of pushing the boundaries of the amendments and the Constitution to cover things that may not necessarily be a right. I could say I have a right to, I have a right to live in your home, because living in your home is going to allow me to pursue my happiness. It's gonna make my life better. And I could use, and lawyers are really good at this. I could use any justification I have to make sure that I say I have a right to live in your house, and for free. You see that there is this there are pros and cons to using the language of rights. So as human beings, regardless of whether rights are natural or not, jury's still out, they are incredibly beneficial to us as human beings living in communities, creating those social contracts, and also serving the God that we worship. What allows me to see the value, the inherent value of other human beings, is to remember that those individuals, regardless of their abilities, they have rights, and those rights were given to them by their Creator. And I am inherently grateful to John Locke for articulating that so well, but I'm also really grateful for someone like John Rawls, who claims that we have the ability as humans to create these contracts that allow a more fair and equitable society. And I'm even grateful for someone like Tom Regan, an animal rights activist, who says, animals are not that different from us. They're experiencing life like we are. And so there's inherent value to these three theories. And I want you to be paying attention to these three theories as we go along in the quarter. Think about what makes a life valuable. And oftentimes, we are able to consolidate those things that give life value, and we assign rights to them, and those rights protect us as living things, as living beings, as humans.